Coming up on this episode of So Now I've Got Breast Cancer.
There's now, I think, no doubt, unequivocal evidence that going through cancer, both the diagnosis but also treatment, can impact our mental health. Yeah, I kind of do feel like my body betrayed me, or I do feel like my body is working against me. And just being aware of those beliefs or those mindsets, I think, is probably the most important first thing.
Health psychology expert Dr Lauren Heathcote talks to me about the impact of breast cancer on our mental health and how to manage that thing we all dread, Scanxiety.
One of the things that makes us successful as a species, right, is our ability to predict the future. And that's meant that humans can do all kinds of things that other animals can't do. But my goodness, it means we're bad at coping with uncertainty.
It's the one simple thing we can do when we feel the anxiety starting to rise.
I would say, and this is actually not evidence-based, I'm talking mostly from personal experience here. And one of the things that you can do is...
This is So Now I've Got Breast Cancer, the podcast for anyone who's just been diagnosed. Today's guest, Dr Lauren Heathcote, is an associate professor in health psychology at King's College London. I saw a post about her latest research into Scanxiety in young cancer survivors, and I knew I had to get her on the show. Welcome to So Now I've Got Breast Cancer.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'm always intrigued. Can you tell us how you got into health psychology in the first place?
So I was a psychology student now many years ago, studying kind of the kinds of things that psychologists normally study, like mental health and anxiety. I was particularly interested in how that looked in young people and adolescents. And we were actually approached by a clinician at the hospital in Oxford who ran the paediatric chronic pain service. And I always remember him saying, the work you do in your lab on young people's anxiety is really relevant for understanding the experience of pain. And I just thought that using science to understand how our brains and our minds influence what we think of as a very physical experience was the coolest thing ever, and have been on that path ever since.
I love that. It is fascinating what you can do these days. Now, I'm going to be honest. As a breast surgeon, I had no idea that having breast cancer would affect my mental health, which just sounds ridiculous, but it never crossed my mind. I thought it was all about the physical. And then I got breast cancer and I felt like everything changed. And I wondered, can you tell us a bit about how cancer treatment does affect our mental health?
Yeah, there's now, I think, no doubt, unequivocal evidence that going through cancer, both the diagnosis but also treatment, can impact our mental health. We tend to study that in several different ways, but broadly we find that it can elevate levels of depressive symptoms as well as anxiety. Interestingly, though, those two things show quite different trajectories over time. So we tend to find that symptoms of low mood and depression can sort of come maybe earlier on in that cancer journey. But they tend to get better over time, not for everyone. But on average, they tend to decrease following completion of treatment. Whereas anxiety shows actually a kind of an opposite trend, where often anxiety, can come from the diagnosis itself, but often doesn't start really peaking until after people have finished active treatment, and can even increase after that time.
So you kind of got in the beginning, oh my God, it's the end of the world, I'm going to die, that's it, that depression. And it can come on several months or years after treatment, it can hit you. But then, as you said, there's the anxiety. And for people who don't know they may be feeling anxious or depressed, can you just go through the physical signs so we can kind of know what it is that our brains might be making us feel?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we often think about the cognitive, the thoughts that happen if we're feeling anxious or depressed, but there's a lot of physical stuff that happens in our bodies too. And they look quite different, whether it's anxiety or depression. But with anxiety, for example, people often report a kind of feeling of tension in their bodies. People can report feelings of fear, like heart palpitations. Those don't tend to happen all the time, but can kind of come on suddenly and out of nowhere, and often you don't even really know why they're there. Something that's less well studied but become increasingly studied now in research are feelings from our stomach. Often feeling unsettled in our stomach. Those seem to be a core part of the experience of anxiety as well.
And I remember feeling physically sick and just this sense of impending doom, and I didn't want to do anything and I couldn't eat. And it is real. It's a real physical symptom. What about depression? How does that affect our bodies differently?
Yeah, depression seems to be a little bit more linked with sort of feelings of fatigue. And there's also this really interesting cluster of anhedonic symptoms. So where, you don't feel like you get pleasure and joy, which can also be a very physical feeling. So there's a lack, of feelings of pleasure and joy within the body as well. But I think it's important to say that there are more differences between people in the symptoms that people experience with the same diagnosis of depression or anxiety than there are similarities.
So if your mum or your granny had it, you may have it, but be very, very different because it's unique. That's really good to know. Now, there's so much to deal with after a breast cancer diagnosis, particularly, but I'd love to know, how does what we're feeling affect how we accept our bodies? Because a lot of us have huge changes, and it's not just the breast, it can be the hair, the eyebrows. Does how we're feeling mentally affect how we take that on board?
I think, again, for a long time, the study of mental health has stayed in the realm of the thoughts, the feelings, and that kind of live up here in the brain. And actually, the way we feel about our bodies, we think in our research lab, plays a fundamental role, both as a consequence of our mental health, but potentially also as a potential cause or something that maintains mental health over time. As you mentioned, Liz, there are sort of changes in the way that we feel that our body looks, so what we think of as sort of body image, and they can be really hard to grapple with over time. But less well studied and less well recognized, I think, are also the changes in the way that we feel about our body more globally. So do we feel like our bodies have turned against us, become an adversary? And do we feel like they're actively kind of working against us in our lives? Or do we feel like our bodies are broken, not working properly? And in our team, we're really interested in studying how what we call core beliefs about the body or mindsets about the body shift after cancer, and how those might actually maintain better or worse mental health over time.
It's really interesting. And I know our previous guest, Louise, was talking about that, how you can be very scared of your body and you don't like it, you don't trust it, you're worried. And cancer is something like, well, it's happened, I'll move on. Whereas I think for me, it was, I don't trust it. And do I blame it? And I don't want to look after it. I don't like it. I don't recognize this as being my body. And it took about 5 years until I thought, no, this is me. I have to like myself. I have to look after myself. Are the things we can do just to help us deal with, like the psychological scar of a mastectomy was huge for me. Are there things you can do to remind yourself that you are okay and it is still nice to like yourself?
The first step, I think, in a lot of psychology and psychological interventions is awareness. I think for some people, this change in their core beliefs about their body, like feeling like my body is not me anymore, or my body is fundamentally broken. Sometimes those happen without us even realizing. And actually, the first time you give words to that and go, actually, I kind of do feel like my body betrayed me, or I do feel like my body is working against me. And just being aware of those beliefs or those mindsets, I think, is probably the most important first thing. And we have interventions, that take multiple weeks where we kind of guide people through this process. But essentially, the kind of next step, if you can get there, is to think about, well, what it would be a more helpful belief about my body that's also true? Is it that my body's invincible? Probably not. But is it that my body is capable, or that my body is resilient? And often going through cancer treatment, you have endless examples of how capable and resilient your body has been, and thinking about whether it's possible to hold those beliefs at the same time or instead of the other beliefs, and let them kind of guide you is a helpful process.
I love that. And I think that's something I had to learn to do, and eventually realize that no one cares what I look like. I grew up in the 90s and it was the heroin chic, and everyone's criticizing every other woman because we're not thin enough or our bums aren't big enough. And do I look fat in this? And you eventually realize, and it was cancer to teach this to me, nobody cares what you look like because they're all worried about what we look like.
It's so true. And it's really interesting because there's a bit of a shift in the body image world right now. So this is kind of outside of the cancer research world, but more in body image and thinking about people with things like anorexia and different conditions, where people are starting to test the idea that actually a helpful thing could be to sort of shift away from thinking too much about how your body looks but to more about how your body functions. That's the thing that's probably more meaningful for you and in your life in the long run, even though, of course, both things are important.
Yeah, I love that. Now, I know, Lauren, you've told me off air that cancer is something you experienced yourself when you were younger. Would you be able to tell us how that affected how you felt about your body?
So I was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma when I was 15 years old.
Now, a lot of people listening won't know what Ewing sarcoma is, but I do. But can you just let them know?
So Ewing sarcoma is a type of sarcoma that happens most commonly in childhood. And it's essentially a bone cancer, and it can come in a limb, or, for example, for me, and it was in my pelvis.
And that must have been devastating to be a teenager going through puberty with everything, your life ahead of you. What was it like?
It's interesting. I think the biggest feeling I remember was shock rather than devastation. And I think it's just so shocking because you feel like these things won't happen to you, especially as a young person. And I often sort of talk with people about how if you're a young person who gets cancer, you lose the privilege of not having to think about your body. When you're young, your body just supports you in your life. You don't have to think about it. It's there. It does its thing. And there's a loss of that privilege if you're diagnosed with cancer as a young person. And I think some effort afterwards to kind of rebuild a sense of control and trust in your body. And that was certainly a process for me.
And I guess you're not legally at the age where you can make decisions yourself, but if you want to do something different to what your parents might want, and that autonomy, and it must just a mental minefield.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when you're 15 turning 16, you are an emerging adult, and I matured quite early. And I think by the age of 13 was ready to be an adult. So having this kind of pulled me back into childhood. It then probably made me even more determined to be an adult and to live an independent life afterwards, which was probably quite hard for my parents because even when I finished treatment, I was still 16. But yeah, I think it changes sort of how you feel in terms of your independence. It can decelerate it, but also then accelerate it afterwards.
Wow. And for anyone listening, bone cancer is really rare. I'm the patron of Bone Cancer Research Trust, but you are how many years now in remission?
21 years in remission.
Wow, that is incredible. There is hope out there. And I'd love to know, did your experience of cancer as a young age affect your own research into young children coping with cancer?
Definitely. It took me a little while to start doing research in this area. For me, actually, I originally was doing research in the area of the psychology of pain. And I just thought that was a fascinating topic to study. And it wasn't until I started learning about the psychology of pain, how, pain is essentially an output of the brain designed to protect your body and to promote behaviors like taking your hand off, that hot plate, or not walking on your ankle if it's broken. And actually, the brain is an amazing thing. It can take information from all kinds of things to decide how much danger there is to the body, including your memory. And I remember learning about this and thinking, gosh, well, cancer survivorship is a really interesting example of when your memories about your pain, for me, the pain was the first symptom and I had it for months before I eventually got diagnosed. Where then afterwards, it became a really threatening thing. Even a tiny pain, a little headache, makes you think the worst. And I actually originally thought this is such a great model for understanding the science of pain, because we can take apart the psychological processes and study them. And it sort of flew away from there. I realized there weren't a lot of people studying the psychology of pain in cancer survivors. People were studying things like how chemotherapy causes pain or surgery, but not the psychological process of coping with and managing pain after cancer. And once I kind of found that gap, I couldn't help but build a whole career of research around it.
I'm so glad you have. And I think people told me that chemo was going to be the hardest part of cancer, and it was. And I can't really remember it. It was really hard at the time. But actually, they were wrong. Because it was when my surgeon said, goodbye, see you in 5 years, that was like falling off a cliff. And I'm sure you must have felt that too. And can you kind of explain why that is suddenly a really, really scary time?
Yeah, I think when you're undergoing treatment, it's really scary, but you are held by the medical system. And you're seeing doctors regularly. You have people to ask questions to. You feel like people are doing things to support you. And then it happens very quickly. Suddenly they say, okay, we've finished and things look good and we'll see you every 3 and then 6 and then 12 months and then not at all. And at first I did feel excited. I just wanted to get straight back to life. And it really wasn't until maybe the few years later that I was like, oh, this has fundamentally changed me as a person. And I feel very different. And I still feel very different from people my age who haven't gone through something similar. But yes, I think what we've seen in our research time and time again is that finishing treatment, losing that support from your team, expected to be okay, that's the time often when those questions arise about what your life will look like, what your body is capable of.
Yeah. And I think it's worse for people who've had chemotherapy because you've had more intensive input from the hospital. You're seen every couple of weeks as a blood test, as people checking in on you. And it's kind of, how do we deal with that survivorship? Because mental illness can kick in months or years later, even post-traumatic stress disorder. Every time I'm walking down the mammogram screening corridor, I'm right back there. But everybody wants you to go back to normal or embrace the new normal, which I hate because nothing about cancer is normal. They need their world to go back, but they can't see that hidden collateral damage, the side effects, the scars, the pain that we live with. Have you got any tips on helping us navigate that or helping us help our family navigate it with us?
I think you're right. So much of the changes that we live with are internal. It's fundamentally changed how we see the world. Also, there's all kinds of lingering symptoms often after cancer treatment, pain, fatigue, as well as the mental health side, and they're not visible to the outside world. I think people find ways to cope with that in different ways. So for some people, talking to other people who've gone through this experience is the best thing, because you talk to someone who gets it and who gets you. And that, as humans, right, psychologically, we want to feel seen, we want to feel heard, we want to feel part of a group. And so talking to people who've gone through an experience like that can overcome that. But it's not for everyone. I didn't join any support groups after finishing cancer treatment. And only now, 20 years later, I'm, because of my research, I'm involved in a lot of cancer charities, but it was never with the purpose of sort of sharing my experience. I think for me, being able to recognize that cancer gave me both really challenging but also brilliant things has been the most helpful part. I do see the world differently, and that can be really frustrating at times and isolating. But also, it's given me this kind of lust for life. It doesn't mean I don't have bad days or that I don't have worries, and I absolutely do. And as a scientist, I think it's fascinating because it shows us that mental health is not an all or nothing thing. You're not either mentally healthy or mentally unwell. As a cancer survivor, oftentimes we both hold, this lust for life, this, what we call benefit finding, alongside anxiety, low mood, worries and fears. And I think recognizing that you can hold both and that's a life well lived is a helpful thing.
Yeah. I think for me, realizing it's a roller coaster, and I can be completely happy and having the best day of my life, and the next day I'm right down rock bottom or worried, and the silly things can trigger it. And you're right, forums aren't for everybody. When I first was diagnosed, I went on a few, and the doctor in me wanted to start correcting and giving medical advice. I thought, no, I need a patient forum. And I found a couple of doctors, and they're the people I can rant with, and I can tell the crazy thoughts in my head that my husband won't get. And yes, he's jealous, he's not part of it, but they can't understand. And having that place to go and go, ugh, means I'm not pissed off when family and friends say the wrong thing, because they're coming from a place of kindness, but I have that place to go. Now, I want to move on to the big one, Scanxiety. It's a word I had never heard of until I became a patient, and I'd love you to explain what it means to people listening and tell us a bit more about it.
So Scanxiety is essentially the fear and worry and anxieties I think many, if not all, people face around times of scans. I think importantly, there's this catchy term Scanxiety that suggests it's all about scans. But for many people who go through things like leukemia, they don't necessarily have scans, but they might have blood tests, for example.
Yeah.
In the research world, when we study Scanxiety, we tend to include both scans, but also things like blood tests, anything where you're waiting for results. And often those results are, instantly life-changing. Is your cancer back? Is your cancer showing signs of improvement if you're still undergoing treatment or not? And my goodness, we're not prepared as humans to deal with these,
Nope.
these stressful waiting periods. Again, we were talking earlier about people experience things differently. And we just held a big workshop actually last week, all on Scanxiety, with people who've had different cancer experiences. And it can feel quite different for different people. For some people, they really feel that tangible fear. For others, they feel more of a dissociation, more of a shutting down, more of a feeling like you're stuck and maybe you can't do anything until you've got those results, and then you can keep moving forward with your life.
That's really interesting. And I guess most people with cancer are going to feel it, aren't they?
Most people. I have absolutely spoken with people who don't experience that. So it's not universal, which fascinates me because scans have always been terrifying. Terrifying for
yes.
me. But most people, it's a hard time.
I remember the first time I'd banged my head on a low wooden beam in my house, and I'd forgotten, and I had a soft, squidgy bump on my head, and I was convinced it had spread to the scalp, the bone in my skull. And I saw my oncologist. I was paranoid. I said, I need to CT scan. And I imagined the worst. And my husband said, I can't cope with you doing this every single time you have a symptom. And it was fine. And some of my scans haven't been great. My cancer has come back, but I find it hardest when you think there's a worrying symptom and you eventually pluck up the nerve to tell your doctor, and they go, oh, I'll refer you. And you think, oh my goodness, they think it might be something. Now I'm really worried. And then sometimes having the scan can be a relief because the scan's done. You can't influence the results, but other times you're waiting. And I imagine the worst. I'm a doctor. I know people who've had bad things, and I imagine it, and you are prepared for it, and it's shit. And I've now learnt through 10 years of this now that I have to tell my husband what to do and what not to do. I have to tell him I'm going to be an irritable, moody cow that can't think, that will snap, that doesn't care what she eats tonight until I get the results. So expect this from me. I apologize later. And I have to ask him not to say it will be fine, because he's a surgeon and he cannot imagine it showing my cancers come back again. So he is begging and praying with everything that it will be fine. But you and I know no one can predict that. And then, and this is a lot of this story, but often when it is good news, everyone is delighted and they're dancing from the rooftops, yay. But I'm like, oh, fuck, I'm going to have to go through this again in the future.
Oh, yeah, I resonate with all of those things. One of the things, so we were co-designing a Scanxiety support tool in our workshop last week. And one of the things that came up was it could be helpful to ask for permission from a loved one to be irritable, not at your best, but also ask permission from yourself. Sometimes it's hard. We just think, I should be fine. I've done this now for 4 years. I should be able to handle it. But actually giving yourself permission to be not at your best. I also get very irritable around scans. I get very irritable when people say, it'll be fine. And I'm like, you don't know. You have no idea. So it is a challenging experience. And I would say that up until, a few years ago, at least in terms of the research world, it was kind of considered just, as a consequence of best practice cancer care, right? We've got to scan you and it is stressful, but it's the best thing we can do. And now I'd say people are recognizing this is a really hard thing. And actually, if we study it, if we research it, we can understand it and then we can help people in managing it. So I think in the next few years, we'll see an increase in the amount of research coming out about this, and therefore hopefully evidence-based tools to support people through it.
Brilliant. Because I never told patients, I didn't know, to tell them that when you're waiting for a scan, you're going to be mentally a nightmare. I didn't tell them to prepare for it, so they didn't know it was coming. And I think that could be another thing for doctors or nurses to say, this is going to be a really difficult time. This is what to do. How can we prepare? Is there anything that's been shown to help or to make Scanxiety worse? Because I know everyone listening is going to go through it again at some point in their life. Yeah.
The research is very early, but we're starting to see things that we might have some evidence either don't help, and so people can potentially stop doing them, or maybe could help. One of the practical things that I found really helpful, and many people have said they found helpful too, is actually talking with your doctor and asking them to give you the results straight away. one of the hardest things about being in the waiting room and on the day itself is you overinterpret everything. Your appointment's running a bit late and you think, oh, that's a bad sign. Or you see the doctor looking stressed and you go, oh no, that means something bad.
Yeah. And the thing is, when I was training as a doctor, we were taught to drag things out, to get the patient to kind of say it for you. And, what do you think it might be and how have you been? And you'll just get to the point. And when my surgeon gave me bad news once, she just said, right, it's come back. It's like, oh my God, that was brutal. But thank you for not making me wait. So if you're listening as a healthcare professional, just tell us quickly.
There's a beautiful
that's a great
article.
Tip.
Yeah, and Bruce Feiler was the first person to coin the term Scanxiety in writing in a Time magazine article in 2011. And there's a beautiful line in his article that says, the doctor comes in and asks me, how are you doing? And I say, you tell me. And I remember finding that hard every time the doctor would come in and say, how are you? I'd be like, I don't know. You have to tell me how I am. And then we could have a real conversation. So I think that's a good top tip. And then for the individual, we published a study last year where we studied different coping mechanisms that people use in the run-up to their scans to see if we could see which ones seemed to be more helpful or harmful. What we studied were two key things that people told us they do. So one is hoping for the best, being optimistic, hoping for a good outcome, which in other stressful waiting periods can be helpful. And we also studied bracing. So this is both a physical and a mental thing where you're mentally preparing yourself, but you're also often physically preparing yourself. You're tensing to receive bad news. People think that doing this will then help to kind of buffer against the bad news if it comes. It can be a protective kind of feeling like maybe you're gaining some control where often you have none. So we wanted to know whether these two kind of well-studied coping mechanisms were helpful in waiting for scan results. What we found was that firstly, this was young cancer survivors, those young survivors who were genuinely hopeful and optimistic or use that as a coping strategy. They didn't actually report less fear and worry in the week before the scan. We studied them every single day and they showed the exact same trajectory as people who said they weren't hopeful and optimistic. And I think this is probably a useful thing because sometimes our loved ones, say to us, just be hopeful, be optimistic. Actually, the research suggests that it doesn't buffer against the fear. You might hold both at once, but it doesn't necessarily buffer against it. So I think that's actually vindication to say, no, I don't have to be hopeful and optimistic.
Yes.
Interestingly, what we found is that bracing for bad news did predict whether people showed more fear. So if you've said, I tend to brace for bad news, in the full week before the run up to the scan and the results, people reported more fear, more anxiety. And that was while controlling for general differences in fear of recurrence. So it might be that actually this active bracing for a long time, like whole week beforehand, overall makes the fear worse. And what we don't know, I should say, Liz, is whether bracing just before you get the news, just as you're going into the room, could be protective if you get bad news. There's some evidence in other literatures that could be helpful, but physically bracing and mentally bracing for a whole week beforehand, we found actually kind of made the fear worse.
Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? I think for me, I had to imagine the worst. I had to find out how bad it could be. And then I'd gone there and I could come back up again. And it's like, it might happen. I know what might happen. And now it's out of my control. And that kind of helped for me until the minute where you're about to be called in, where there's nothing you can do. But just that, okay, I've accepted what might happen. Now let's move on, can help. But it's really hard. But another worry that we all have is the fear of recurrence. And a lot of people with cancer don't realize it can come back in the future. And it's something I thought about every day for the first 5 years, because you have the scars, you have the tablets, you have the treatment, and it is part of the mental impact of survivorship. Will it ever pass? Are there things we can do to help deal with that fear of recurrence?
The evidence would suggest that overall it goes down over time, but slowly. Not a few months, but often several years. For some people, they find, hitting a certain milestone, like the 5-year mark, for example, can then kind of have a step change. But But I will say that the evidence, suggests that when you ask people, are they still fearful of recurrence 20, 30 years later, it's not a no.
Yeah.
And for many people, it lingers. For some, it stays, pretty high for a long time. That's very normal. In terms of what helps, there's actually a lot of great research out there on interventions for fear of recurrence. It's a really flourishing research field. One of the things that we've found helps a lot is to think about what we call like metacognition, and that's our thinking about our thinking. So often it's good to ask yourself, like, why am I sitting thinking, about the worst possible scenario? Why am I thinking about, what if it comes back? And often what we're doing that for is to feel some sense of control, or the opposite, actually. Sometimes people think, if I worry too much, then that will cause my cancer to come back. So these are all what we call metacognition. They're thoughts about your thinking and what effects that thinking has. Thinking about that side of things, and often talking to someone about those, and sort of realizing that actually, worrying too much probably isn't going to be a thing that causes your cancer to come back, but also worrying too much isn't going to necessarily prepare you and actually is detracting from your life. Sometimes that alone can be helpful.
That is fascinating. And I guess are you worrying about your cancer coming back because there's other stuff in your life that you don't want to deal with? And I remember a good friend of mine, he's sadly no longer with us. He had melanoma with a 95% chance of a cure, and it came back. And he told me he was almost glad the day it came back because he could stop waiting for it to happen. And I get that. Nobody wants advanced cancer in their right mind, but that constant fear can be really hard. And I think the only thing that helped me, because I used to fret and worry about how bad my cancer was and my odds of being alive in 10 years and I won't make it. And actually I realized it's out of my control. I can take the tablets and I can exercise and eat well, and it might still come back, it might not. And you can have a 95% chance of being cured, but there's no way of knowing whether you're that 95% or the 5% who aren't. And it took me 5 years to get there, but that's kind of how I keep myself going on a daily basis. But it's hard and it takes time to get there.
Yeah. And it's interesting. And one of the things that makes us successful as a species, right, is our ability to predict the future. And that's meant that humans can do all kinds of things that other animals can't do. But my goodness, it means we're bad at coping with uncertainty. We're bad at living in the moment.
I'm not in control of this. I'm a surgeon. I need to be in control of everything. And it's really hard, isn't it? But I think one of the social media has been amazing for me. The day I told Twitter I had cancer, it saved my life because people came and gave me advice, and it's this huge community, but our friends keep dying. And it seems like the world is full of young people dying on Instagram because our grannies aren't on there. And there's the thing called survivor's guilt. Did you feel that? Can you tell us what it is?
Survivor's guilt is those feelings essentially of, why did I survive? Why am I, the lucky one up until this point, at least, and others didn't? It's very common. I'd say it's another one of those things that can live in the background. And it's not until you hear someone else talk about it that you go, oh, yeah, I felt that too. There's not a lot of research into survivor's guilt, actually, and where it comes from. But, if we think about guilt as a general emotional experience, it's a social emotion. It often comes, as all emotions do, from a protective, adaptive place. We feel guilt because overall that bonds us to other people. If we feel like we've done something wrong to someone else, that's a bonding thing because we then repair that social bond. So as with fear, as with everything, there's an adaptive function to it, but it doesn't feel great. And if you feel it too much, too often, that can be harmful for us.
And I think I found it really hard because you want to be there to support your friends who are going through, maybe their cancer has come back, it can't be cured, but you are also seeing what might happen to you in the future. And there's a part of you that just wants to walk away and say, I cannot deal with this. I cannot be there for you. But there's your heart saying, I need to be there for you. And I think finding people you can talk to about what you're feeling, so you can just be there for your friend, but you've got someone else who can be there for you as a cancer patient, can really help.
Yeah. I think finding those special people in life who can hear you say, I'm terrified of dying, but also I feel bad that I'm the one who's lived, and can just be like, yep, that sounds right. And not say, oh, you don't have to feel that. And, like there's a lot of well-minded, well-thought people out there who might say, that's okay, you don't have to feel like that. But actually finding those gems who can go, yeah, that sounds okay. And just sit with it is helpful thing. So ultimately as humans, we want to find people who get us and get it.
Yeah. And I hope if you're listening, you all have one of those special people in your life. So we've talked a lot about what we know at the moment. Are there any interventions that you're looking at now that might help us cope with our mental health when we're going through cancer?
Oh, yes. So there's several things going on in our lab, and we're fundamentally interested in whether bringing in the body more to our mental health treatments will make our interventions better for people struggling with mental health problems after cancer. And so we are testing interventions right now to see if we can help people, for example, in noticing and choosing core beliefs or mindsets about their body that are helpful. And we're also studying whether we can help people tune into their bodily signals in a helpful way, use it to feel like their body is working with them and supporting them, rather than necessarily against them. But there's also lots of work being done all over the world, and particularly actually on interventions for fear of recurrence. Right now, there's several research groups in Australia who are testing digital interventions, because a big challenge we have is access. There's maybe one psychologist working in your big cancer center, and often their time is taken up by people who are actively on treatment, who need, who are in crisis mode and need support in the moment. But there are digital tools that are coming in the near future.
I love that. And it's great to know that this is being taken seriously, that the mental effects of cancer are being researched. They know that we need help. So thank you for people like you and everything you're doing to help us cope, because it is shit. It is really, really hard, and we need to raise awareness and give people tools to help. And so I wanted to ask, and I could talk to you for hours. The scientist in me is really geeking out, but we don't have hours. Any final words of comfort or calm for anyone listening? Is there one simple thing we can do when we feel the anxiety starting to rise?
I would say, and this is actually not evidence-based, I'm talking mostly from personal experience here. One of the things that you can do is do something that makes you feel alive. We live in our minds, we live in the uncertainties. And actually, if you can do something that makes you feel alive right now, I've been loving going to the sauna and doing the cold plunge.
Yes.
It makes me feel alive. And that is one of the biggest, I think, sort of fingers up, I guess, to cancer that you can have, and something that I lean into, when I feel the anxiety taking over.
That is a great tip. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your personal story with us, Lauren. It's been brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
That was Dr. Lauren Heathcote, and you can find her recommendations in the show notes. Now, if you enjoyed listening to this episode of So Now I've Got Breast Cancer, please give us a 5-star rating, share it with your friends and family, share it online so we can help as many people as possible. I'm Dr. Liz O'Riordan. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. So Now I've Got Breast Cancer is produced by Birdline Media.